was a really popular restaurant, and it was, they say, next to a Adventist Union Conference office. And people like to go over there. And so they would go, a lot of the employees would go over to this conference office, restaurant next there, the conference office, and they would go there, even have meetings over there. They would frequent it. And one day, they all met over there, and they met around the table, and the waitress came and took their order. And well, she had a little like a frown on her face, like she was a bit confused. And they asked her, well, is everything okay? Do you have the order down? Or she says, no, I got the order down. I'm just a little confused because when you guys come here together, you always order the vegetarian items, but when you come here by yourselves, that was interesting. Is it a sin to eat meat? It depends. It depends. So I want to make sure that we all understand where we place what we're about to talk about. And I think it sounds like from the answers that I'm hearing that we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, okay? We are bidden to follow the Ten Commandments. So what is the definition of sin? It's a transgression of the law. And the law specifically is of the Ten Commandments. So for us to say that eating meat is a sin, we would have to say that God asked the high priests, so the priests that worked in the temple, on a daily basis to sin. Because what were they eating? Red meat. Not a lot of it, maybe a very tiny amount, and it was symbolic. But nevertheless, it was what they were commanded to do. Trying to make sure we don't get too much. And then if we're not talking about red meat or even meat in general, was Christ perfect? Did he ever sin? Oh, I hope so. I hope he never sinned, right? Otherwise, we're here for no reason. We have no hope. But Christ ate fish, didn't he? Someone once made that point, to which there was a reply in the church, well, he didn't have the benefit of the health message. It's really concerning when you hear that. But some will even say, well, what about Daniel and his three friends? Remember Daniel and his three friends? Weren't they tested right at the beginning? I want you guys to think about things, and I want you to investigate. What would happen if the government all of a sudden decided and said, we have identified a group of people in our country that don't follow our laws, and we have decided that we don't want them reproducing, and we're going to castrate all the males? Would you think that would be okay? That's exactly what happened to Daniel and his three friends. That's exactly what happened to Daniel and his three friends. They were eunuchs serving in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And you said, well, they could have put up a fight. They said, hey, you are defiling the temple of the Holy Spirit. And they would be right. In fact, there were laws, Levitical laws, that prevented males who were castrated from serving in the temple. When they went back, they had to rewrite those laws because so many of those that went back to build the temple wouldn't be able to serve in that temple. So they had to modify that. So I want you to put into your mind what it is that Daniel and his three friends have to do. Do you believe that we're going to have to really decide and figure out what is the law of God and what we're going to have to keep and what isn't the law of God? I think that's the case. So why would Daniel and his three friends, and I want to set the thing before we talk about meat because I think it's going to be important. Daniel and his three friends would be willing to be castrated, but not eat meat. Does that seem a little inconsistent? Is there anything in the Ten Commandments that says that you shouldn't be castrated? In fact, Jeremiah predicted that was going to happen. Do you remember the prophecy? If you guys keep doing, was it Jeremiah? Was it Isaiah? If you guys keep not following the Lord, your men are going to be taken away to a foreign country and serve as eunuchs in a foreign court. That's what he predicted. He predicted that that was going to happen. He was right. Because God showed it to him. It was a conditional prophecy, and they met the conditions of the prophecy, meaning that they were idolaters, and that's exactly what happened. So there's nothing in the Ten Commandments that talks about that. But what about not eating the king's meat? Well, you know what we need to do is we need to study a little bit deeper. If we go to Prophets and Kings, the issue there at the king's table was not so much about it being meat, actually. Do you remember what the issue was? It was offered to idols. Now, is there a recommendation in the Ten Commandments about not doing idolatry? Absolutely. So Daniel's three friends knew exactly what was a condition that met the Ten Commandments and what didn't meet the Ten Commandments. You can read it there in Prophets and Kings 4:81. Ellen White's very, very clear. At the very outset of their career, there came to them a decisive test of character. It was provided that they should eat of the food and drink of the wine that came from the king's table. In this, the king thought to give them an expression of his favor and of his solicitude for their welfare. But a portion having been offered to idols, the food from the king's table was consecrated to idolatry, and once partaking of it would be regarded as offering homage to the gods of Babylon. That's the issue. If they had veggie links offered to idols, would they have objected? Yes, they would have. So let's firmly put in place where the discussion about red meat is, because let's boil it down to a practical, very practical thing. You've done an evangelistic series, and a lot of new people have come into your church, and you're ready to have a new member potluck. You know where I'm going on this, right? You know where I'm going. You're going to have a new member potluck, and they're going to be bringing these things so that we can all eat. I have no disclosures. These are the objectives. And they bring, God forbid, a lacto-ovo-vegetarian dish to a vegan potluck. What do? This is a crisis. Call a meeting. Well, I'll tell you, if you don't want to get a reputation, unfortunately, it's too late. Because I like to say that the church is like Noah's Ark. It's full of chaos, tumult, smelly animals, but in a flood, it's the only place I'd be. Correct? And so, in some cases, we have admonition of the person bringing that. Don't you know that this is don't you know about, have they not? We're letting everybody in the door, and they're not being fully educated. Do you know what Ellen White says about that kind of behavior? Listen to what she says. Think about this. Remember that if by the injurious use of your pen, I'll say here of your voice, you close the door to even one soul, that soul will confront you in the judgment. Oh, how much has been said that has turned souls to bitterness and gall against the truth. Words that should have been a savor of life unto life have been made a savor of death unto death by the Spirit which accompanied them. So we're going to talk about meat, but this is not an issue of law. Everybody has a different walk. Yes, we know what the goal is, and we're marching there, and we should never use diet as a club over somebody else. Okay? And that happens too often. The other thing I would mention too, and Anna brought this up to me, I'll mention it very briefly. This also goes along with what David was saying in terms of authority in the church and in medicine. We've just talked about how we need to be drinking a lot of water. We just talked about how we need to be eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, maybe even bananas and tomatoes and avocados. In Ellen White's time, they did not have dialysis. So if we don't have the understanding of exceptions, And as Anna works like in a dialysis lab, is she going to be going to her dialysis patient saying, eat lots of tomatoes and avocados and drink lots of orange juice and drink lots of water? This is going to help you. It's not going to happen. Okay? So we need to make sure that we understand that there are exceptions to these rules. And we don't always understand this, but people who are in a medical field will understand this, and we can save a lot of problems if we make sure that people are understanding these things. These are general health principles, and I would suggest that if that person on dialysis may have been following these 30 years ago, they may not be there on dialysis. But now they're on dialysis. And as Ellen White says, circumstances change things. Okay? So let's be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves. And with that, we will get started. Okay. And I think my battery is running down. No, we'll just do it this way. All right. Okay, so let's get started. We have a lot of slides to cover, as you probably see. I've actually cut some out, so if you're following on there, we may be skipping, okay? So metabolic health and lifestyle medicine should be a cornerstone of future pandemic preparedness. Folks, people are waking up. COVID-19 has woken people up to the idea that we need to start thinking about things. This is what they showed. In 5,700 patients hospitalized with COVID-19, 57% had hypertension, 42% had obesity, 34% had diabetes. What the conclusions of this paper were is that COVID-19 mortality may come from inflammation. Guess what else is associated with inflammation? Obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. These are modifiable risk factors. Chronological age may not be as important as immune or biological age. And lifestyle may make a large difference in terms of survival. People are willing to hear, and this is the opportunity. Though these diseases associated with worse, this is the quote, though these diseases associated with worse outcomes are based on specific diagnostic criteria, it is likely that these immunometabolic changes lie in a continuum as health changes over time. Considering that recent estimates in the United States suggest that less than 20% of adults have optimal metabolic health. A sliding scale exists that could still place the majority of adults at some degree of increased risk of susceptibility to certain infectious diseases, COVID-19 being one of them. More broadly, the comorbidities associated with increased risk of severe COVID-19 are also characterized as having presence of low-grade chronic inflammation. That's going to be the key that we're going to be talking about today, low-grade chronic inflammation. This is a talk about meat. You may have think you've heard all of this stuff. There's going to be some new stuff that you've never heard before, likely. All right? And they go on, and you can read it. They're talking about using lifestyles and biomarkers, okay? Regardless of whether or not exact underlying mechanisms are currently understood, it is clear that the tenets of lifestyle medicine have extraordinary power to improve the health of the population, both overall as well as in the face of unknown future pandemics. That's really, my ears perked up when ostensibly atheistic scientists are writing this, okay? For instance, a wide variety of dietary approaches have been shown to be effective in providing long-term weight loss, reductions in blood pressure, improved glycemic control, even reversal of type 2 diabetes. These include dietary approaches to stop hypertension and Mediterranean diets. More severe disease may benefit from a more restrictive approaches for a short period, including low-fat, whole food plant-based diets, low-carbohydrate ketogenic diets, and severe caloric restriction. Now, you'll give them a little leeway there by including low-carbohydrate ketogenic diets, right? This is them looking at the scientific literature. Unfortunately, this is what's happened in terms of poultry and meat consumption from 1970 to 2021. We eat more meat today than we used to. And you'll hear these arguments online all the time. How could eating meat be so bad? We've been doing it forever. And they bring up evolution, we adapted to this. This is what we've been made to do. In my mind, I'm thinking, reproductive age happens far earlier than the consequences of eating meat. People die of meat eating in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. They usually reproduce in their teens and 20s. Right? That's what we've done. So I don't understand how eating meat could affect evolution, even if you believe in the theory. This is really interesting. I found this to be really interesting. This was a clinical guideline. I don't know, have you seen this one, David? This is really bizarre. November 19, 2019, right before the pandemic hit. Okay? This was a point of view epidemiologically, unprocessed red meat and processed red meat consumption, dietary guideline recommendations These are the dietary recommendations from the Nutritional Recommendations Consortium. All right? Bradley Johnson, PhD, Dana these are these people. This is what they said. Okay? They looked at all the data, and they also looked not just at, they looked at more of an intention to treat type of model, epidemiologically. Like, how many people really want to change their diet? And this is what they said. I was blown away with this. The panel suggests that adults continue current unprocessed red meat consumption, weak recommendation, low certainty evidence. Similarly, the panel suggests that adults continue current processed meat consumption, weak recommendation, low certainty evidence. That's what they said. Target audience for recommendations. The target audience for our guidance statements was with individuals who consumed unprocessed red meat or processed meat as part of their diet. The panel took the perspective of individual decision-making rather than a public health perspective. Now, realize this is funny to me because this was published right before coronavirus pandemic. Isn't that fascinating? Now, what do? We think in terms of public policy because of the crisis that we have. Now, if you actually do some research on this, they found out that 14 out of the 15 authors are regular meat eaters, of whom 13 eat processed meat and 6 consume 3 or more meat servings per week. So this is kind of the hill that we've got to climb when you have these type of people writing these types of articles. And certainly when people want to cherry pick and debate you in a public forum about whether or not you should continue to eat meat or not, this is the kind of stuff they're going to gravitate to. So just be prepared. Okay, I'll go back if you want the citation. This is in Clinical Guidelines. Sounds good. November 19, like literally just a month. In fact, probably coronavirus was circulating at this point already. We just didn't know it. Okay? Fascinating stuff. Yet, at the same time, after the pandemic hits, we get articles like this that show very clearly that as age goes up, huge risk factor for COVID-19 mortality. We see there that female has a higher mortality rate. Male has a higher mortality rate for COVID-19. Obesity, it's very clear. The more obese you are, the more likely you are to die of COVID-19. And then look at diabetes there. Diabetes uncontrolled with hemoglobin A1Cs greater than 58 millimoles. This is the metric scale that they're using here. So clearly, this is the issue that we've had. And boy, I'd certainly like to see if those authors would like to revise their understanding. Again, they were looking at what should an individual do rather than a epidemiological. I don't know exactly sure why they did that. Now, if we look at our own health study, this was 96,000 Adventists living in the United States and Canada, 50-page diet. You guys know this, right? I mean, we grow up on this. What's the first thing that you notice? Which was really interesting to me, in the Adventist church, almost half the people in this study are not vegetarian. That's the first thing that struck me, right? And what's really powerful about this study is that this is a pretty homogeneous group of subjects. They all sort of are, upwardly mobile, middle class perhaps, probably have some interest in health. Maybe they go to church. So you're taking away all of those confounders that a lot of people like to put into these healthy lifestyle studies. We'll show one later. It's a classic one where they, in the UK, where they recruited people in Great Britain from health food stores. Okay? And then they did a vegetarian study based on that. And there's a lot of criticism saying, these vegetarians have the same mortality as these health-conscious non-vegetarians. So it looks as though all the vegetarian benefit is coming from the fact that you have a healthy population in general. They don't smoke, these sorts of things. But you really can't say that here because really nobody here is smoking, generally. Very low alcohol consumption. They're pretty healthy people. The only thing that differentiates them is their diet. And you can see here that this is just the number of people in the study. As you can see, a lot of them were non-vegetarian. And we can look at the BMI, their diabetes, hypertension. I like to look at it as a graph format. This is just BMI. Okay, so the only group that actually met a normal BMI was the vegan. And where did you lose most of that benefit? As soon as you added lacto-ovo eggs and milk. That's when you lost your BMI. And then from there, it just got worse and worse and worse as you went up. Okay? And so you can see there that there is increased risk for COVID-19 mortality right at about a BMI of 23. And then we considered overweight. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians were just over 25 at being overweight. That's BMI. Now, when you factor out the overweight status, the BMI I should say, there still remains, despite the fact that you rule out the BMI using multi-regression analysis, the risk for diabetes is a stepwise function. Okay, so there we have it. Now, this is not a randomized placebo-controlled trial. We just discussed why it's hard to do that in dietary studies, but it's a fairly large epidemiological trial. So I think it's, and this is hypertension risk. Risk for diabetes, hypertension. Risk for diabetes, hypertension. Pretty much exactly the same, okay? Another paper that was published in 2011, vegetarian dietary patterns are associated with a lower risk of metabolic syndrome. This is the paper that was published, Adventist Health Study 2. And take a look. Vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, non-vegetarian. We can look at HDL, you can look at triglycerides, you can look at glucose, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, waist circumference, and BMI. In every way, shape, and form, it was better as you went to more to the vegan and you cut out the cheese and the eggs. We'll talk about cheese in a little bit here and why that's basically cheese is. It's probably very similar to red meat, at least in the way we're going to talk about. Okay? Metabolic thresholds, risk factors for thresholds. So we have vegetarians, semi-vegetarians, and non-vegetarians. Look at the risk factors. How many of them had 3 risk factors for metabolic health problems? It just goes up as you go down the list. 4 risk factors goes down the list. 5 risk factors just go down. It gets higher and higher. What about metabolic syndrome prevalence? You can see exactly what you would expect, that as you introduce more and more meat into the diet, that you're going to get more and more of these metabolic risk factors. Okay, the China study. We're all familiar with the China study. This is, again, a very large epidemiological study. T. Colin Campbell, I actually heard him speak at Loma Linda. How many of you heard him speak before? Yeah. He's been attacked recently, hasn't he? They've been really trying to attack him. There's a huge industry in terms of diets. You'll see this all over the internet. Doctors put up their diets, and they have to continue. They have a perverse interest in continuing their thing. I don't want to paint everybody that way because I don't want to be painted that way either. On the flip side, but there is a perverse and very large market out there for dietary lifestyle. And one of those things that people love a lot is to be able to say, "Eat your meat," right? Atkins diet, remember the Atkins diet? Now they call it paleo. They just keep changing the name on it. It's a little different, but it's pretty much the same. It's been known, the China study has been known as the 20-year Grand Prix of epidemiology. Massive study. This was done, of course, before a lot of mobilization in China. They were able to look at populations in the cities versus in the countries, and they died of completely different topics and things and diseases, and dietary things were looked at, and they found that, so a lot of the Western diet is going to cause a lot of the Western diseases that we see. Take a step back and think about this. If you were to go to sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, or Africa, do you think they have cath labs? No, they don't have cath labs. We in this country are the ones that have the guidelines that say as soon as the patient hits the door, we have to have the EKG so quickly, and then they have to be, we have the 90-minute and the 120-minute or whatever it takes to get from, door to skin, they call it, before they put the needle in and they do the cath. Which country is that in? It's in this country, because that's what we need in this country. And it's because of meat consumption that's going up, I would say. British Medical Journal, page 1996, dietary habits and mortality in 1,000 vegetarians and health-conscious people, the results of a 17-year follow-up. That's a very large study in terms of length. This is the study that I was referring to before. So they took 10,000 subjects in the UK. They were recruited from health food stores, advertisements, periodicals, and so you're recruiting a very health-conscious type of people, right? They asked them about their diet and the types of food that they ate, and they followed them for about 17 years. They had, on average, there was about 1,300 deaths, less than 80 years of age, generally speaking. And here are the results. 43% of that group were vegetarian. 62% ate wholemeal bread daily. 27% of them ate bran cereals daily. 38% of them ate nuts and dried fruit daily. 77% ate fresh fruit daily. And 38% ate raw salad daily. It sounds like the kind of people that I would see walking into the Loma Linda market, right? This is the kind of people that we were thinking. So they looked at the overall mortality, and it was half the mortality of the general population. And people started to say, wow. When they looked at the subgroups, they saw that fresh fruit daily reduced ischemic disease to just 76% of the population, strokes 68% of the general population, and mortality from all causes 79% of the population. This was in 1996, and it got people talking. Really started to get people talking about being a vegetarian, because it was a fairly landmark study at the time. But there was a lot of criticism of it, as you can imagine, and we'll talk about why that was. So what they did, here's another study. This one was published in 2012. Red meat consumption and mortality. Results from 2 prospective cohort studies. And what did that show? So they looked at 2 types of meats. So people started to say, okay, vegetarians seem to have a better mortality rate. Maybe it's not meat. Maybe it's processed meat. I'll tell you, this is what you hear all the time. Well, maybe if I have grass-fed meat, and it's good cuts, and it's raised organically, and so and so forth, as opposed to eating these processed meats like salami and hot dogs, and that's garbage stuff. And I see this all the time. People who really like their meat, they say, yeah, it's the people that go out and get the hamburgers and the French fries and the hot dogs. They're the ones that are bringing all our numbers down. So be prepared for that when you have your health meetings, and this is what they're going to tell you. And so they have this unprocessed meat versus the processed meats, and they're saying the processed meats are the devil, but the unprocessed, grass-fed, organically raised, lean cuts, this is the good stuff. I mean, how can you argue with millions of years of evolution? Okay, I'm feeding you here, okay? I'm getting you ready for this. So 37,000 men from health professional follow-up study. This is 1986 to 2008. And guess what? Multivariate adjustment for major lifestyle dietary risk factors found this. In 1 serving a day of the following: unprocessed red meat, processed red meat, all-cause mortality, there was an increased risk. Yeah, it was worse with processed meat, but it was still there in unprocessed meat. Those brackets, by the way, as you guys know, because it doesn't include the number 1 in it, or unity, that means that's statistically significant in a 95% confidence interval. So those numbers that we're looking at there are all statistically significant, because none of those go below the number 1. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, that's statistics. So in other words, I would say that if you ate unprocessed red meat 1 serving a day, you have a 13% increased risk of all-cause mortality. If you ate processed meat, you have a 20% increased risk for all-cause mortality. Does this make sense? Okay, quote from the study: these 2 large prospective cohorts of U.S. men and women, we found that a higher intake of red meat, doesn't matter if it was processed or not, was associated with a significantly elevated risk of total cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality, and this association was observed for both unprocessed and processed red meat, with a relatively greater risk for processed red meat. This study was done in the United States. That becomes important later. Now, what are the strengths of this study? The strengths of this current study include the large sample size, the high rates of long-term follow-up, detailed repeated assessments, diet, and lifestyle. All participants were health professionals, minimizing potential confounding. So in other words, you have a homogeneous group. Health professionals are generally interested in health, we hope. Okay, they generally have the same income. Okay, so you're not dealing with socioeconomic disparity here. In addition, the FFQs, or the questionnaires used in these studies, were validated against multiple diet records. However, the measurement errors inherent in dietary assessment were inevitable. This include misclassification of ham or cold cuts as unprocessed red meat. So you may have a little bit of a mix-up there. And inaccurate assessment of red meat content in the mixed dishes. Because of the prospective study design, any measurement errors of meat intake are independent of study outcome ascertainment and therefore are likely to attenuate the associations towards the null. So the fact that they actually showed a difference means that, that despite this possibility, there was still something there. The association between red meat and cardiovascular disease mortality was moderately attenuated after further adjustment for saturated fat and cholesterol, suggesting a mediating role of these nutrients. In other words, even though saturated fat and cholesterol, it went down a little bit, there was still a relationship. However, we could not assess whether lean meat has the same health risks compared to meat with higher fat content. So they tried to answer this question. Is it processed only, or is it just the fact that it's meat in general? And it sounds like the answer is both. Processed meat is worse than red meat, but it's not like red meat has no risk. There's another study, prospective study of over 500,000 people. Meat intake mortality, this is 2009. This is conducted by the National Institutes of Health. 47,000 male deaths, 23,000 female deaths during 10 years of follow-up. What did they find? Notice again, none of these brackets contain the number 1. It's all greater than 1, so they're all statistically significant in a 95% confidence interval. And what did they find? Once again, red meat, processed meat, all of them associated with all-cause mortality, cancer, cardiovascular disease. In fact, in this case, it looks like red meat was even worse than processed meat. So they calculated the population attributable risk, representing the percentage of deaths that could be prevented if individuals adopted red or processed meat intake levels of participants in the first quintile. That means the lowest 20%. For overall mortality, 11% of deaths in men and 16% of deaths in women could have been prevented if people decreased the red meat consumption to the level of the intake of the first quintile. That means if the people at the top went down to the bottom, you could have reduced 11 and 16% respectively in men and women. That sounds like an epidemiological sound intervention, doesn't it? I wonder if they looked at that at the very beginning. And it tells you a little bit more there as well as in terms of red meat consumption again. But they note there are various mechanisms by which meat may be related to mortality. So this is what the scientists are saying. What is it about red meat that causes us to have problems? People talk about, iron. We talked about iron, and they say the same thing here. In relation to cancer, meat is a source of several multi-site carcinogens, including heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are both formed during high-temperature cooking of meat, as well as N-nitroso compounds. You guys, know the connection between smoked fish and nasopharyngeal carcinoma. That's something that we all studied in medical school, especially in Japan. There seems to be a high risk of that. Iron in red meat may increase oxidative damage and increase the formation of N-nitroso compounds. Furthermore, meat is a major source of saturated fat, which has been positively associated with breast and colorectal cancers. Okay, so the data from the United States is clearly showing that it doesn't matter if it's processed or unprocessed, you should not be taking meat. Enter our European friends. Meat consumption and mortality results from the European prospective investigation into cancer and nutrition. This is known as the EPIC trial, published in 2013. It's the largest study on diet and disease to be undertaken, prospective, which is good. 500,000 healthy adults, mostly aged 35 to 70, were enrolled in 23 centers in 10 European countries, okay, including in the UK at Oxford. They decided to set out and ask the same question. So there it is. They looked at 448,000 men and women without prevalent cancer, stroke, or myocardial infarction. And what were the results? As of June 2009, 26,000 deaths were observed after multivariate adjustment. A high consumption of red meat was related to higher all-cause mortality, and the association was stronger for processed meats. After correction for measurement error, higher all-cause mortality remains significant for only processed meat. We estimated that 3.3% of deaths could be prevented if all participants had processed meat consumption of less than 20 grams a day. Significant associations with processed meat intake were observed for cardiovascular diseases, cancer, and other causes of death. The consumption of poultry was not related to all-cause mortality. Conclusion. The results of our analysis support a moderate positive association between processed meat consumption and mortality, in particular due to cardiovascular diseases, but also to cancer. This was hailed as the definitive test, the definitive study for all those people that like to have their grass-fed, organically grown, lean-cut meat. See, I don't need to stop eating my meat. I just need to blame all those people that are having their hot dogs and hamburgers from In-N-Out Burger. I want to make sure you guys are armed with the studies that that are going to come to your health thing that are going to tell you about. Okay? Now, it's interesting if you, this thing's not working. All right. Here's the data. Our analysis suggests that men and women, we already read that for you. Okay, now let's go into the study and let's see what they're thinking. These are the Europeans, right? People with the nose up in the air a little bit, talking about, realize that America had just come up with a bunch of studies that showed that it didn't matter, processed or unprocessed, and now the Europeans are coming out with their study. This is what they say. Some prospective studies have evaluated the association between meat intake and mortality, but several of these studies were comparing meat consumers with vegetarians. One of the most recent studies conducted among EPIC Oxford participants revealed that vegetarians, as well as non-vegetarians with a health-conscious lifestyle, had statistically significantly lower mortality compared with the British general population. This is similar to the results of a German cohort in which both vegetarians and health-conscious non-vegetarians had a statistically significantly lower overall mortality compared with the general population. These results indicate that the decreased mortality in vegetarians compared with the general population is in large part due to a healthy lifestyle, that is, being non-smokers. Do you see how they're writing off the amplitude of the signal from being a vegetarian? Oh, you're just measuring it in healthy people. Of course they're going to be healthy. Okay, I want you to see what they're saying. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm just telling you, you need to be aware of this data, okay? However, and they're saying this now, they're having a concession that at the U.S. there's data coming out. However, large U.S. cohorts have reported an increased risk for early mortality among individuals with high red and processed meat consumption compared to low meat consumption independent of smoking, obesity, and other potential confounders. Do you see what they're saying? They're acknowledging the fact that the U.S. has come up with some data, but their data is better, is what they're about to say. Within the European prospective investigation into cancer and nutrition, including more than 500,000 participants from 10 European countries and thus reflecting a very heterogeneous diet, our study is better, and thus reflecting, we examined the association between meat consumption and the risk for overall cause-specific mortality. In contrast to the U.S. results, we observed a consistent association between processed meat consumption and total mortality, but not between red meat consumption and total mortality. Processed meats such as sausages, salami, and bacon have a higher content of saturated fatty acids and cholesterol than fresh red meat. The latter is often consumed after removing the visible fat tissue. You need to process it correctly, whereupon the proportion of fat in sausages often reaches 50% of the weight or even more. Both high saturated fat and cholesterol intake have been found to be related to the risk of coronary heart disease. Also, processed meat is treated by salting, curing, smoking in order to improve the durability. In other words, they're saying processed meats, we're going to throw them under the bus. Right? These processes, however, lead to an increased intake of carcinogens or their precursors, or to a high intake of specific compounds, possibly enhancing the development of carcinogenic processes, for example, nitrites. Interesting, isn't it? And that's where things kind of stayed. That's why you hear all the time about processed meats. Processed meats are bad. I don't have any of those processed meats. I have my organically grown, you know what I'm saying. Don't take that away from me. enter sialic acids. This is the part that you probably haven't heard about before. So I want you to pay close attention. This is the part to wake up, wiggle your toes. Yes, exactly. Sialic acids. What are sialic acids? On the cell surface of all of your cells, you have proteins, and then you have glycoproteins. Proteins are kind of like the arms. Glycoproteins are like your hand, if you had arms on the outside of a cell, and then your fingertips are sialic acids. It's a 9-carbon sugar. It coats the proteins throughout the whole body. Notice what they say here. It's the major function of sialic acids and glycans on different cell types is to help the innate immune system. Remember we talked about that? Is to help the innate immune system discriminate between self and non-self. If you mess that up, are you going to get a bigger antibody response? Yeah. As a result, different tissues express tens to hundreds of millions of glycan chains per body, per cell, and are capped by sialic acids. Is this a big issue? This is a big issue. You ought to know about sialic acids. So here are the glycans. That first red box is what it looks like in yeast. The blue dots there is the proteoglycans. The green dots there are sugars. That's, in this case, it's mannose. The next red box is what an insects look like on their cells. By the way, do you know who discovered cells? Van Leeuwenhoek, way back in the 1700s. No formal training in science. He was a creationist. He was a Dutch Reformed man, and everything he discovered, he says, was to the glory of God. He's the one that actually discovered cells. Okay, so don't tell me that evolution, that you've got to be an evolutionist and a scientist, that religion and science are at odds with each other. Most of the discoveries that we've made are from God-fearing men and women. Isaac Newton wrote more about prophecy than he did about physics. Okay? So these are on the cells, non-human mammals. I want to focus your attention to the red box in the upper right-hand corner. These are what we call non-human mammals. Okay, that would be red meat. That's a definition of red meat, is anything that's a mammal. And since we're not talking about cannibalism here, we're going to talk about non-human mammals when we talk about red meat. I want you to notice that on the very tip of those things are these diamond-shaped boxes. Some of them are white, and some of them are purple. Do you see that? There's only 2 types. And if you look over at the key on the left-hand side, the only 2 types there are is something called nu5AC and nu5GC. That's going to be important for you to understand. nu5AC and nu5GC. I'm going to just talk about them as AC and GC. Okay? Notice that in non-human mammals, do you see both AC and GC? Yes, you do. Now let's jump down. We'll skip plants because we're not talking about plants right now. We'll skip down to human. What do you notice about the human sialic acids? They're all AC. And this is the issue that we need to talk about. Apparently, humans, well, I don't want to say what we used to have. Let me just tell you what we know now. We see the enzyme in our DNA, but it's mutated. There's an enzyme that would convert nu5AC into nu5GC and allow us to put it on the surface of our cells. But that enzyme is no longer functional in human beings. So this sialic acid receptor is actually the receptor, by the way, that allows the flu virus to get inside of you. And it's actually the target of medications like Tamiflu. So this is a really important thing on the surface of your cell. We could talk about SARS and MERS. It's also involved in this too. There's a connection, but it goes beyond what we're talking about. There's been a lot of research on this. But let's talk a little bit more about the sialic acid. So there it is. The arrow is pointing to the white on the non-human mammals. That's the nu5GC. But in humans, it's just nu5AC. So mammals have both. Humans only have one. And this is the enzyme here that we are lacking. We're lacking this thing called N-glyconeuramic acid. It's at the top. Cytidine monophosphate N-acetylneuramic acid hydroxylase. There's going to be a test at the end on this. Make sure you know that CMAH, CMAH, is an enzyme that converts AC into GC. We don't have that enzyme in humans. We see it there, it's in our DNA, but it's been mutated, and so it's non-functional. So scientists say that we used to make nu5-GC, but at some point we stopped being able to make nu5-GC. And so we don't make it anymore. Now, that's important to understand because when your body is in development, there is an education process of your immune system to determine what is self and what is non-self. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Did you guys all go through Loma Linda and have immunology? I had John, what was his name, the immunologist. Oh, he was great. Anyway, he talked about the thymus as T-cell university. And as the T-cells would go through, if they didn't get the correct education, they would be tossed out. So as a human being is growing up, since there's no nu5-GC on the surface, okay, what happens is that eventually antibodies get made against nu5-GC because you make antibodies against everything in your body that's not self. Does this make sense, what I'm telling you? So as you start to eat things, as you're growing up, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age, you have no nu5-GC anywhere in your body, and you start to develop antibodies against it because you might ingest it. Okay, especially people who are growing up who don't have, who might eat milk products because it's in milk as well, any animal product. But we don't have it. We don't have this enzyme normally. Now, if you want to take a look at see what the content is of nu5-GC in a lot of these non-human mammals, you can take a look at that. We've got some samples here: beef fat, pork, lamb. Beef has got about 25 units. Pork is even higher at 67. And just before you think, aha, that means pork is worse than beef, well, look at lamb, right? The priests used to eat lamb, right? 97. It's even higher. Ham, about 44. Look down there at milk. 3.51, cheese, 17. Here's the thing that you have to understand is that when you eat those products and you digest them, the nu5-GC, which you don't make, gets absorbed into the body and it floats around in your circulation, and the enzyme that puts those sialic acids on the surface of your cell can't tell that that's a nu5-GC versus a nu5-AC. The difference between them is one oxygen molecule. And so what happens is that nu5-GC gets put onto your cell surface, even though it shouldn't be there. And that's right at ground zero where your immune system determines, is this you or is this not you? So have you ever heard of that term, you are what you eat? So to your immune system, your cells start to look like the surface of the cow when you eat cow. They start to look like the surface of sheep when you eat sheep. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is an actual incorporation of this. This is not pseudoscience. These are very well published things. Mechanism and uptake of incorporation of non-human sialic acid and glyconeurominic acid into human cells. This was published. A lot of work they're doing down there at UC San Diego and La Jolla. A guy by the name of Ajit Varki. He's published a lot of material on this, but not just him. Here they show very conclusively that this nu5-GC gets incorporated into the cells, goes to the lysosomes, and then gets put onto the surface as a sialic acid. And you can see here, by using high-performance liquid chromatography, he can show you very clearly, looking at the red box and the blue box, that as you do the experiment, these things get incorporated into the cells. This is the basis behind serum sickness. Injecting horse serum. Horse is a non-human mammal. Guess what? It has nu5-GC. So all humans have circulating anti-nu5-GC glycan antibodies. Everybody has it. IgM, IgG, IgA. The more you stimulate your body with antigen, guess what's going to happen to your antibody? We know that from the virus, right? The more you're exposed to the virus, the higher your antibody. All humans have varying levels of circulating IgM, IgG, and IgA antibodies against nu5-GC glycans. Multiple quotes. I'll just read for you what they say here. A group later showed that human anti-nu5-GC glycan antibodies appear during the first year of life and correlate with the introduction of new 5-GC in the diet. Sera from infants aged 0 to 12 months were analyzed, and anti-new 5-GC IgM and IgG antibodies against new 5-GC started to appear at the time these infants were weaned onto cow's milk-based formula. Interestingly, anti-new 5-GC IgM antibodies were absent at birth and at 3 months, appeared at 6 months, and the levels stabilized at 12 months. There was no difference in anti-new 5-GC IgM and IgG titers between male and female subjects. The absence of anti-new 5-GC IgM antibodies in cord sera suggests that anti-new 5-GC antibodies are not germline encoded, quote, natural antibodies. You develop these things. And that would make sense, because if at some point in our previous history, let me just say maybe before the flood, before we were supposed to be eating, we were told to eat animals, okay? If we allowed to eat animals, thank you. If we had antibodies against it, that would have been a problem. So it's interesting to me that these antibodies are not part of our natural set of antibodies, but get developed. But instead require a postnatal antigen stimulus. Anti-new 5-GC antibodies are likely to be affinity-matured antibodies, as has been shown earlier. However, spontaneous generation of anti-new 5-GC IgM or IgG antibodies in SEMA null mice. What's SEMA? It's that enzyme. So SEMA is the enzyme that we're lacking. All the other animals pretty much have SEMA. We don't have SEMA. They have SEMA. We can make an animal model of humans by knocking out the SEMA enzyme. So that's what they're talking about. SEMA null mice. So in other words, here's a mouse that would normally have SEMA, be able to make new 5-GC, but now we're knocking it out. So now they can't make new 5-GC, so now it's kind of like a model. They say here, however, spontaneous generation of anti-new 5-GC IgM or IgG antibodies in SEMA null mice did not occur even when large quantities of new 5-GC were fed to them. So here's another difference. We don't have SEMA, but when we eat new 5-GC rich foods, we make antibodies. Mice, who we make null, in other words, we humanize the mice, when we feed them foods rich in new 5-GC, they don't make antibodies. We don't know why that is. So in other words, if you really want to do a true model of what a mouse model of what happens in humans, you would have to not only make them SEMA negative or knockout, but you'd also have to infuse anti-sialic acid new 5-GC antibodies into them because they don't make it themselves. Does this make sense? Okay. So this is the figure from this article. You can see it here pretty clearly. Let's use my mouse here. Here is the human being. All humans are SEMA negative. We lost it apparently, they say, millions of years ago. Anyway, loss of new 5-GC. Okay, so what happens? We eat things that look like this. And then what happens is we now start to incorporate new 5-GC into our cells. We develop new 5-GC antibodies. This causes chronic inflammation. Okay? This is known as xenosialitis. Why do we call it xeno? Xeno means from another animal. Sialitis, sialic means sialic acid. Itis is inflammation. They believe that this might be the reason why we see vascular coronary artery disease at higher levels in people who eat red meat. They believe that this may also be the reason why we see cancers. Do you know what they found? And when they look at actual cancers, these cancers are expressing new 5-GC. Even though the human being doesn't have the DNA to do this, the cancers in the human being are expressing new 5-GC in multiple cancers. You see what's going on? This is data that's only come out in the last 5 years. Okay? A lot of this got buried. So here's some photomicrographs, light microscopes. Chicken. Is chicken a mammal? No. So is chicken going to have new 5-GC? No, it's not. Okay? So chicken, fish, they don't have new, I'm talking about non-human mammals. These are not mammals. So if you look here, we're taking chicken's anti-new 5-GC, and we're using chimp serum. Why do we use chimp serum? It's because that actually has the new 5-GC in it. And basically what this photograph is showing you here is that when you have the antibodies, they bind to the new 5GC. And so you can see that clearly here. Here's prostate carcinoma. Here's normal prostate. Do you see here how we have the staining? Here, we don't have staining. Colon carcinoma, no staining. Here, we have, here we have colon carcinoma. Here, this is normal colon, no staining. Okay, I'm not going to read all of that there, but basically what I'm going to show you is one of the studies here that I think is really important. Red meat-derived glycan promotes inflammation and cancer progression. This gets into the epidemiology. I put it there in the handout if you want to read more about new 5GC. Here's a study that they did where they took mice, they knocked out the SEMA, in other words, they humanized them, and they say that new 5GC-rich porcine submaxillary mucin, which contains 7 to 9% weight per weight of bioavailable glycosidically bound new 5GC, adds only a minimal amount of neutral sugars and amino acids to the diet, and can cause mouse tissue incorporation of new 5GC over a period of weeks, which is about the same as it would be in a human who had been eating red meat for many years. So what they did is they looked at a number of things. IL-6, which is a bad cytokine. They looked at serum SSA, which again is bad. Serum HP, which again is a marker for inflammation. And they looked at, again, down here as well. And what they showed is that when you take SEMA negative or humanized mice, okay, and you put them on soy for a diet that doesn't have new 5GC in it, this is your baseline. When you add new 5GC to their diet, their inflammation does not go up because, remember, they don't make antibodies. When you infuse new 5GC autoantibodies, that's when inflammation goes up, conclusively showing you that you need to have both new 5GC sialic acid incorporated into your cells and the antibodies together to cause the inflammation. Same thing here with this graph, same thing here with this graph. As you increased the amount of antibodies, also the inflammation goes up. So the more antibodies you have, the more inflammation you have, and you see that at every level. So what this graph is showing you is that you need both sialic acids on the surface, which are non-human, and antibodies to have inflammation. It also shows that as the amount of antibodies goes up, the inflammation also goes up. Okay? That's important because we're going to talk about a study in humans here very shortly, because I'm sort of leading you up to that. This slide is simply showing you that this sort of problem can lead to increased cancers in mice who are on those types of diets. As you can see here, the ones specifically here, all mice here at the bottom were all mice down here were immunized against new 5GC, so they all have antibodies just like humans do. And those that were fed on a new 5AC diet, 0 adenomas, 0 carcinomas. Those that were fed on a new 5GC diet, red meat, 2 carcinomas, about a 29% increase. Again, these are mice. Here's the interesting paper. It was published right in the middle of the pandemic, so probably didn't get a lot of attention. It's a great study. It was published in France. That's important because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, they looked at a number of cheeses. And nobody knows their cheeses better than the French. 16,000 adults, all of whom had registered for a maximum of 6 dietary records. They looked at the ingestion of new 5GC, and it was calculated based on records and knowledge of food products. This is the graph that you want to take a picture of. When you want to look at your glycemic index, okay? On the left are all the different types of cheeses that they looked at. And you can see there that the worst offending was a Torquay. And then there was Roquefort. Then there was dry cheese. All the way down, I was so happy to see that mozzarella cheese was the lowest in terms of glycemic index, 0.03. Okay, so your mozzarella cheese sticks are okay. I'm just kidding. We don't know what else is in there. All right? So in other words, they took these foods and they were able to figure out how much new 5GC were in these foods per gram. They did the same thing with meat. You can see their meat on the other side. They set beef equal to 1.00, and you can see there that pig sausage, cow pate, pig liver, all of these things have a different amount of the glycemic index because they're going to talk to these people, they're going to figure out what they ate and how much they ate, and what they're going to try to do at the end of this is figure out how much new 5-GC did they ingest. That's basically what they want to figure out, okay? And when they did that, they found something really amazing and something that you would think would be understandable, but they really needed to make sure. We see men on the left and women on the right, and this is in France. So notice here that they looked at how much, they sorted basically how much new 5-GC did someone take in, and they divided them into 25% quartiles. And you can see those quartiles there as they go up. It's interesting to me that a lot of first of all, that men in general consumed more GC than women did on the whole. Do you see that? That's number one. Number two, that the majority, well, now I would say that there was a higher propensity of GC in men coming from meat sources, whereas in women, it was coming from what? Dairy sources. I found that was interesting as well. Nevertheless, they're actually more similar than they are different. But the thing that was very interesting is the stuff in color down below, because they were able to show that these groups that increased their consumption of new 5-GC also showed a correlation with increasing what? Antibodies. And we already showed that when you increase the number of antibodies to new 5-GC, you get more inflammation. And so for the first time here, what we're showing in human beings is that it's correlated. The more new 5-GC that you consume in your diet, the more likely you are to have sialitis from antibodies against new 5-GC. So they said, described experiments provide ample evidence that new 5-GC consumption from red meat and dairy can dictate the eventual levels, repertoire, and characteristics of circulating anti-new 5-GC antibodies in humans. Given the association between red meat and cancer, notice they said red meat and cancer, not processed red meat and cancer, these studies warrant further investigation into the role of new 5-GC and anti-new 5-GC antibodies into the risk of human diseases, including cancer. Question for you now. If I raise my cow on organic grass and I make sure that they are great cuts, lean, not processed, is that going to do anything to my new 5-GC? Nothing. It's innate in the meat. Now, that doesn't mean that there's people, I can tell you right now, there are scientists right now that are working on ways of sprinkling something on the meat that gets rid of the new 5-GC. I'm telling you, it's happening as I speak. They're working on this. They're trying to see if they can figure this out. But the point, and there's probably going to be something wrong with that too, right? But the point is that here we have a situation that may explain why people who eat red meat, regardless of processed or red meat or whatever it is, why they may be getting more inflammation in the blood vessels. And I think we're going to show that a little bit more here. Here's a study that was published in 2019, Association of Biological Therapy with Coronary Inflammation in Patients with Psoriasis. So people with psoriasis get put on anti-inflammatory medications. We call those biologics, right? And what did they show? They showed that if they have coronary disease, that after they get put on these biologics, which are anti-inflammation medications, that their coronary disease actually gets better. What does that lead you to believe? That coronary disease is an inflammatory disease. And that's what's going on here with sialitis. You guys all know this guy, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, Caldwell Esselstyn. What did he do? He kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit, might say, with the nuts, but everything else seemed to be pretty good. What did he show? That when you reduce these things that cause inflammation, your angiograms improve and you can actually reverse heart disease. You guys know this very well. I don't have to belabor that. So that leaves us with the last question, which is, if sialitis is one of the engines that generates inflammatory disease in the blood vessels, it should be not just processed meat, it should be both processed and unprocessed meat, correct? Remember this study that showed the Europeans kind of put their nose up in the air at the Americans and saying, no, it's not regular red meat, it's only processed meat, right? And they said, this is the biggest study, this was heterogeneous, we did it in 10 countries, you guys were homogeneous over there, we don't know what you were finding out. Well, guess what? Another study, this time from Great Britain. Meat consumption and risk of 25 common conditions, outcome-wide analysis of 475,000 men and women in the UK Biobank study. This is a huge study. They put this is one of the benefits of a single-payer system. I'm not saying you should have a single-payer system. I'm just saying this is one of the benefits, is that all the information can be in one place and they can do great studies to try to figure this stuff out. And this study is a result of that. They say there's limited prospective evidence on the association between meat consumption and many common non-cancerous health outcomes. We examined the associations of meat intake with a risk of 25 common conditions. We used data from 474,000 middle-aged adults recruited into the UK Biobank study between 2006 and 2010 and followed up until 2017, 8-year follow-up with available information on meat intake at baseline, linked hospital admissions, mortality data. This was a huge study. This is what they found. Let me step you through this. So both unprocessed red and processed meat intake, when you group them all together 3 times a week, notice what was on the right side of the line. That's the stuff that went up: ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, venous thromboembolism, pneumonia. That's something that we didn't really think about, right? Eating meat is associated with pneumonia. Diverticular disease. I didn't put an arrow next to colon polyps, but that's there. And this was kind of interesting. It almost met statistical significance, but female genital prolapse was associated. I'm not exactly sure why that would be. Diabetes, no surprise there. That was all associated with both when you group them all together. Now the question, let's tease them out. Let's look at processed versus unprocessed and see what the data shows. Here's unprocessed red meat. Okay, this is the category that the EPIC study said we didn't find a correlation, and we did a great study. Guess what? Unprocessed red meat more than 3 times per week associated with ischemic heart disease, associated with pneumonia, associated with diverticular disease, associated with colon polyps, associated with almost urinary tract infection, almost female genital prolapse, and associated with diabetes. Do you see the red arrow there? The red arrow is pointing to the one protective thing that they said in the study that eating red meat was good for doing, and that's preventing iron deficiency anemia. Now, we've already talked about how iron is potentially one of those things that can mitigate disease, and we've also said that if you are someone who has a lower iron level in a sea of people who eat red meat, and they make these lab values based on the general population, you could look low, but maybe you're actually normal and everybody else is high, right? Nevertheless, I'm just putting that out there. This is kind of the stuff that they would say. And then, of course, processed red meat, we knew this all along. This is not controversial, and you can see the very same things there are associated with that as well. But they also looked at chicken. Just when you think that Colonel Sanders thought that he dodged the bullet, poultry meat is up for grabs here, and poultry meat does not have new 5-GC in it. So we can't say that new 5-GC is the mitigating mechanism or engine for this, but there's some interesting things here that you may not have known that people who eat chicken more than 3 times a week was associated with. Number 1, ischemic heart disease. How about that? Hemorrhoids. Maybe we're not having enough fiber and things get a little bit locked up there. How about gastroesophageal reflux disease? I found this fascinating. Gastroesophageal reflux disease, we were just talking about what a epidemic we're having. It's been associated with poultry meat more than 3 times per week. Gastritis and duodenitis. Maybe we're not getting that retroactive, maybe people who eat chicken typically don't rest their bowels as much. Who knows? Diverticular disease, colon polyps, gallbladder disease associated with eating chicken more than 3 times per week. osteoarthritis. Fascinating stuff. And then, of course, diabetes there at the bottom. If you guys want the reference to this, let me just go back. This is the reference if you want to look at this. This was just published in March a year ago. So very up-to-date stuff and a very large study. And the biobank is just churning out data like you wouldn't believe. Biobank is really, really cool. They're getting a lot of good information out of that biobank, okay? So that's poultry. So what do they say? Our findings from this large prospective study of British adults show that meat consumption is associated, just meat consumption, right? Not processed meat, but meat. Chicken, fish, I mean, they didn't talk about fish actually, it's chicken and red meat, is associated with higher risks of several common conditions, but with a lower risk of iron deficiency anemia. The higher risks are at least partly accounted for the higher BMI, and some of the associations remain even after adjusting for BMI or waist circumference may still be due to other aspects of adiposity. Additional research is needed to evaluate whether these differences in risk reflect causal relationships, and if so, what proportion of incident cases for these different outcomes that could prevent by decreasing meat consumption. They did talk about the role of BMI, as I said. There was a reduction in some of those effects, but it did not go away. You guys have seen this study. We've shown it to you 3 times. Okay? This says that if you have a vegetarian diet or plant-based diet versus a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet, you're less likely to get severe and moderate COVID-19. And these are the graphs. Is there going to be more evidence coming out? There's a study called the Covidence. It's a play on COVID and evidence together. The Covidence UK study, and they are actually looking at these very same things. So in terms of getting more dietary and information, this is something where we need to look out for. So in summary, evidence points to metabolic syndrome and SARS-CoV-2. Certain diets are associated with outcomes. Sialic acid and the immune responses offers a testable explanation for why red meat is associated with ischemic heart disease and cancer. And while more research is needed, an emerging picture is developing. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.